My name is Shelby Ellison, and I will be serving as your host for today's webinar. Today's presentation will be given by Professor Kevin Crosby from the Department of Horticultural Sciences at Texas A&M University. Dr. Crosby researches vegetable crops, including melon, pepper, tomato, onion, and carrot. The emphasis of his research group is to elucidate the genetic mechanisms for stress tolerance and enhanced nutritional quality. Today, Dr. Crosby will be speaking about pepper breeding and genetics in his presentation, Peppers Are the Most Important Part of Salsa. Now I'm going to switch control of the screen over to our speaker, Dr. Crosby.
Thank you, Shelby. It's nice to be here. Talk about one of my favorite groups of plants, and that are the peppers, also known as chiles in Mexico and pimentas in the Portuguese-speaking world, Brazil. Like tomatoes and potatoes, they're part of the Solanaceae family, which is obviously a very important crop family, and they're warm season perennials and naturally self-pollinating crop. They do exhibit some protogeny and protandry, though they do maintain quite a bit of uniformity through inbreeding. They're a diploid species with 2n equals 12 chromosomes. And as you can see from the picture, they have a lot of phenotypic diversity, which makes them an interesting crop. They are not related to black pepper, though they are now the most important spice in the world. And maybe they could be credited for the discovery of the New World, because Columbus was looking for spices on his voyage. All of them are native to the New World, from Mexico all the way to Argentina. The most important are the cultivated types are the Capsicum annuum, and those are mostly from Mexico and Central America. The other species are important more in South America, and particularly in the lowland areas for Capsicum chinense, and in the highlands for Capsicum baccatum and Capsicum pubescens. As I mentioned, annuum includes such as the bell pepper and the jalapeno pepper, and they're very important in many parts of the world. They've been selected and bred much more than the other species. Capsicum chinense is very common in northern Brazil and Venezuela, Colombia, and tropical regions. The Habanero is the most notorious of this group. Frutescens is also a tropical lowland species from northern South America, and in Brazil it's common. Tabasco would be the most famous Capsicum frutescens. Pubescens is a less common pepper cultivated mostly in the high Andes, and it's fairly cold tolerant, and it's not heat tolerant. It doesn't cross at all with other species of capsicum. And baccatum is a very important species in much of South America, but rarely cultivated outside of that region. This is wild pepper growing commonly in South Texas, also all the way throughout Latin America. This wild species called chili piquin. It's subspecies aviculare of Capsicum annuum, and it's quite a hardy bush, even cold and heat tolerant, can survive freezing temperatures to some degree. Within pepper there are many types, and these are largely due to the fact that it has been bred by humans for thousands of years for fruit quality, and much of the fruit quality relates to shape and appearance and size and pungency. These are many of the common types grown within the United States and Mexico, and of course the bell pepper being grown throughout the world as the most popular sweet pepper. In the United States, bell peppers are responsible for about 2/3 of total production, and they're all sweet pepper, the bell pepper, and generally consumed in a salad, but also used in certain cooking. Anaheim pepper would be the second most common, also known as New Mexico or chili pepper or hatch pepper, and it is consumed largely as a processed product, but more increasingly as a fresh cooked product. And then these other types are largely produced in other locations and imported, particularly jalapenos now are largely imported from Mexico. Others that are on the market are considered specialty types. India is by far the biggest producer, largely because they consume a lot of peppers. China also produces a lot and exports a lot too in the form of powder. And Mexico is the largest per capita consumer, so they eat a lot of peppers in Mexico. Also, these other countries produce and or consume quite a lot. In Spain, it's mostly sweet peppers that are produced, whereas in Pakistan and Korea, mostly hot peppers. Peppers have a unique pungency determined by some vanillyl alkaloid compounds called capsaicinoids. And in order to measure these, Wilbur Scoville determined that by a dilution procedure, he could classify them and give a relative scale of pungency, or how they burned your mouth, so to speak. Now, since then, we're able to analyze them with high-performance liquid chromatography to get an exact quantification of the different capsaicinoid compounds, which all contribute to this unique heat in peppers. This is a typical chromatogram from our lab, where we measure some of these different compounds, and typically capsaicin and dihydrocapsaicin are the predominant forms. All of them could contribute fairly equally to the heat sensation. And here's a chart giving the range: bell pepper and other sweet peppers completely lacking capsaicin of 0, all the way up to habanero type peppers, which are in excess of 1 million Scoville on some of the ones that are available these days. Pure capsaicin, based on a Scoville scale, would be about 16 million. Now, bell peppers are large, blocky, and blunt, and have been selected for larger and larger size, mostly based on consumer appeal. They're frequently consumed green, but then mature into a rainbow of colors based on their carotenoid profiles and other pigment compounds. And at this mature stage, they're much more nutritious. So even though more consumed green, there's a growing interest in consuming them when they're more mature because they're more nutritious. As I mentioned, there's a multitude of colors: orange, yellow, white, purple, brown. In Europe, a very popular type is the very elongated Lamullo bell pepper, and this is grown frequently in protected culture and demands a very high value. Both the crop and the seed are very valuable. And then some peppers are able to produce anthocyanin strictly in the epidermal tissue, and some of them have been bred as a different variety just for consumer appeal, not necessarily for the health benefits. The relative concentrations are somewhat low. In other peppers, this is an unfavorable quality, such as jalapeno. They do not want anthocyanin. The cayenne pepper is the most important processed pepper in the United States and has been the subject of a lot of breeding to improve it for disease resistance. It was originally selected in Louisiana and is a component of the most popular hot pepper sauces, some of which are called red hot sauce or Louisiana sauce or Cajun sauce, and they're very important for a lot of cuisines, chicken wings and other things, and for pepper flakes and hot sauces. The Hatch or Anaheim chili is the most important pepper in New Mexico, and also is grown in Texas and California. It has several hundred years history in New Mexico, and so there are many land races there. And it's usually not that hot, though there are some selections that are quite hot. It is the most popular powder pepper in the United States. This is one developed in our program to implement some virus resistance or introduce some virus resistance genes into one of these types of peppers. Also, better heat tolerance and concentrated maturity. Now, wax peppers are very popular in some areas, particularly the banana pepper, the sweet banana pepper. Anyone that goes to Subway could see these, or many other restaurants. In parts of Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, it's also extremely popular, this type of pepper. And they range from completely sweet to fairly hot, even hotter than a jalapeno in the cascabel types. Poblano pepper is the most important pepper in Mexico for spice. It's grown to be dried as whole pods or made into powder and used in very many of their recipes, such as mole. And it's usually not very pungent. It can be slightly pungent, but it shouldn't be excessively pungent. And it is also an important component of one of my favorite things, the Chilerelleno, which is a stuffed ancho pepper stuffed with some meat or rice or cheese and baked and cooked in a sauce. Jalapeno pepper is the most important fresh spicy pepper in both the United States and Mexico. It's a very integral part of Texas cuisine, actually. Having grown up here, I can't remember how early it was. I think I was probably 3 when I ate my first jalapeno. This is imported largely now from Mexico, which is the proud producer and origin of this pepper from the Jalapa region. It typically is quite spicy, between 2,500 to 5,000 Scoville. And when it's dried, it makes up chipotle, which has become a very popular ingredient in many cuisines in the United States. Serrano pepper is one of the most popular peppers for fresh use in both Mexico and Texas and California, particularly to make fresh salsas. It has a unique flavor, and it is typically quite pungent, more so than a jalapeno typically. It comes from eastern Mexico and also from the Puebla region. Now, Tabasco pepper may be the most famous pepper in the world because it's a trademark. It's an idea. It's almost a culture. This hot sauce has been around for over 100 years in one family, and it is the most common hot sauce condiment in the world. The pepper itself is quite pungent. It's also quite ornamental and grows on a large, vigorous, fairly disease-resistant plant. Now, Capsicum chinensis is also the group that includes the habanero and the world's hottest pepper, the Trinidad scorpion, and its relatives. It's a very diverse group of peppers, all coming from Brazil, Colombia, Venezuela region, parts of Peru, not from China. That was a misnomer by the botanist that classified it. It typically is lantern-shaped and is typically green or light green or dark green, maturing to a rainbow of colors, much like a bell pepper. However, unlike a bell pepper, it's extremely pungent. So buyer beware. Recently, we released a new cultivar of this pepper to improve its disease resistance, particularly for spotted wilt and root knot nematode, which are common problems in peppers. It's one of my favorite, I have to say, as a hot sauce, but as I mentioned, a little goes a long way, extremely pungent. In parts of Mexico and Central America, though, they like a lot of it. The Trinidad scorpion has been classified as the world's hottest pepper, 1.5 million Scoville. Apparently, there's also new variations of this that are even more pungent. Now, the pungency may not be all that palatable, but it is useful for industrial purposes. This compound capsaicin is used in not just pharmaceuticals, but also in defense pepper spray. The military uses it. It's also used to impregnate certain items to keep animals from chewing on them. The Ricotta, or Capsicum pubescens, is the only truly high-altitude pepper. From the high in the Andes, it's frost-tolerant and cold-tolerant and not heat-tolerant. So it grows very well in mild, slightly cool climates. And it makes a very large bush, almost a small tree. And it has a unique trait. It has black seed, completely black seed, unlike any other pepper. It looks like a small apple. They also call it manzano. Has beautiful purple flowers and ornamental looking foliage as well. Macadam is extremely important in parts of South America where it does well in both lowland and highland locations. It's quite adaptable and quite resistant to a lot of diseases and pests. It is frequently very pungent as well. It has a unique trait. Unlike other peppers, it has the yellow spot on the corolla created by a single dominant gene, YS. This can be transferred, though difficultly, into other species as a marker. Here are Peruvian types of the Capsicum bacatum. In Peru, this is one of the more common species of peppers consumed. Now, breeding peppers is really quite straightforward. Pedigree selection has been used more often than not for the development of many inbred lines and cultivars, as well as F1 hybrid cultivars. Mass selection has probably been commonly used with the landrace types that are popular in certain parts of the world where open pollinated seed is still utilized. But you can use both recurrent selection and backcross methods to integrate genetic variation and important traits of interest and enhance genetic variation in your population. And this really should be done more, particularly in such a self-pollinating crop. The physiology of the plant is usually a bush less than a meter tall There are some exceptions, and if they grow as a perennial for many years, they can obviously exceed that size. Generation time can be quite short for most species, between 90 and 140 days, so multiple cycles per year can be made breeding this crop. The first flowers may occur just 40 days after germination and will continue for the life of the plant in a somewhat indeterminate fashion. And the plant may live for 10 years or more, usually doesn't because diseases might take it out, but it can in certain environments. The mating systems would include self-pollinating progenies for open-pollinated cultivars, which has been very common up until the last 15 years or so. All peppers were open-pollinated cultivars. Outcrossing rates are generally not very high, usually less than 5%. There are some instances and some types of peppers where that has been documented to be extremely high, largely due probably to exerted stamens and also a certain kind of bee that's a more effective pollinator than the honeybee. For F1 hybrid cultivar production, manual emasculations and male sterility are utilized by the industry. Male sterility in peppers is not as effective as in other crops or has not been utilized as much as in other crops, largely because it's fairly easy to generate seed by manual emasculations, where labor is inexpensive. There's a genic sterility that's one recessive gene, and it's very stable. And there's cytoplasmic male sterility, which is, there are several different genes identified. It's not as stable and is sometimes temperature sensitive. However, it is used commonly in Korea to generate hybrids. Honeybees don't really favor pepper pollen, so for using sterility systems, it might be necessary to find other species of bees, maybe bumblebees, or other mechanisms for pollen dispersal. The seeds of peppers are somewhat delicate, more so than tomatoes and eggplants. They have a shelf life of less than 2 years at room temperature. However, they can be stored at -20 for greater than 15 years if they're sealed, particularly vacuum packed. The numbers range from 10 to 300 for fruit, so this really impacts the efficacy of producing pepper seed and the amount of plants necessary and how expensive the seed will ultimately be. The most seed is produced in bells and the large sweet types, and the least will be produced in some of the smaller fruited types like Habanero and Tabasco. The variation in seed size is dramatic. Bell and Jalapeno tend to have larger seeds, the largest. Habanero tends to have fairly small seed, and some of the wild species, Chacoense, Cardenaceae, some wild habaneros, some wild bacatums, have very small seed, even half the size of the habanero seed seen here. When it comes to determining what we want to breed for, what are the important traits, as you may have gathered from the previous slides and the many pictures of peppers I've shown, for thousands of years, appearance, size, and fruit quality have been the main attributes that have been bred for and selected by agriculturalists and now by plant breeders. Color, of course, has been, because of the range of colors, has been very important. And then, of course, yield is important, but very, very sensitive to the environment. There's a large impact of the environment and fertility regimes and the soil on the yield of peppers. So it certainly should be selected for, but it will be sensitive to the production location. More and more so in the last 20 years, or maybe even 40 years, disease resistance has become a crucial component of breeding in peppers because it is stricken or subject to a lot of different pathogens and pests. Early maturity is also very important in some locations, particularly for fresh market peppers where the early peppers demand higher prices. Then plant habit and stress tolerance is something that I've worked on, that my predecessors worked on, and it's becoming more important to adapt to different cultivation systems and to deal with issues like water shortages and rising temperatures or declining temperatures depending on your location. Flesh morphology is important to consider, particularly for fresh market, but also for processing peppers. Too much moisture means more expense to remove that moisture when you have to make chili powder. So high dry matter is preferred in drying peppers, whereas more moisture and thickness of the mesocarp is preferred in something like a jalapeno or a bell pepper. Firmness, which is controlled to some degree by the S gene, is very important in fresh market peppers, less so in processing peppers. the mushiness character or softness character caused by the dominant allele is not very desirable for fresh market peppers at all. When it comes to color, of course, the Y gene leads to yellow or orange colored fruit, as opposed to the dominant allele of this gene, which would lead to red colored fruit. And then the SW1 recessive allele would lead to sulfury white, or really lack of carotenoid pigments. Phytochemical content is becoming more important aspect of many vegetable breeding programs and also agronomic crops, because we're coming to understand that food can also be a type of medicine and really important for our health. So in peppers, it's a good place to start. As a vegetable, they tend to have a lot of beneficial phytochemical content. They're replete with ascorbic acid, phenolic compounds in the form of flavonoids. You have capsaicin, which itself has health benefits, and carotenoids, which are known to have health benefits, and peppers are one of the best sources of many carotenoids. The T and B genes in pepper have been linked to higher carotenoids, particularly beta-carotene. On the right, the small pepper is one we've discovered through screening germplasm that is remarkably high in flavonoids, in excess of 500 parts per million, so is much or more than an onion in the case of compounds like quercetin. So we're utilizing that in our breeding program, and I think that could lead to peppers with much higher antioxidant and flavonoid contents. And just taking something out of our breeding program, a line that we've increased the levels of flavonoids dramatically over typical commercial types. And our goal is to create commercial, replicate some commercial varieties, but integrate the genes that lead to high levels of these compounds, and particularly quercetin and luteolin as flavonoids, and vitamin C, which is an important antioxidant that everybody needs to have. Moving away from that and into diseases, it's very important that we consider where we're going to grow peppers. They're very sensitive to the environment, particularly as it relates to disease. In humid climates, they're quite sensitive to a range of bacterial and fungal pathogens. And they're also quite susceptible to insects which vector serious viruses. Bacterial leaf spot has probably been the most studied disease in peppers, certainly from a genetic standpoint. They've identified 7 resistance genes. To date, all 5 of these are dominant hypersensitive type reactions, a gene for gene type of response. 2 of them provide more of a horizontal resistance, race nonspecific, which might be more durable over the long term because the pathogen may be less inclined to overcome this resistance because the pathogen survives just at a low level. Doesn't cause economic damage. To date, at least 10 races of this pathogen have been identified. Insect vectored viruses are another serious problem with peppers, particularly here in Texas and Florida and in other subtropical regions. Spotted wilt is common throughout the range of pepper production, even into the cooler areas in Europe, and it's vectored by thrips. Tobacco etch virus and other podiviruses, pepper mottle virus and PVY, are vectored by aphids and are severe problems in peppers, particularly during early stages of growth. If infection occurs, the crop is lost. And then the Gemini viruses are more common in the tropical climates, extreme southern Texas, southern Florida, and Mexico, spread by whiteflies and devastating to the pepper crop. It usually leads to almost 100% loss of the crop. And then curly top virus is another bigamo virus that is vectored by leafhoppers and is common in New Mexico, West Texas, and California. And in some years, when leafhopper numbers are great, it becomes a serious problem and crop losses can approach 50%. So from the beginning, breeders recognized the need to find virus resistance in the germplasm and identify the inheritance. And results of this were pretty positive. There's been numerous podivirus resistance genes described. They're now named using the PVR nomenclature. Most, but not all, most of are single recessive genes. We've experimented with pyramiding some of these genes together and found that we were able to enhance the level of resistance and also the resistance to multiple strains of some of these pathogens, like pepper mottle virus and tobacco etch virus. Tobacco viruses have been common in many crops, and of course they infect peppers. They're mechanically transmitted and can be spread by human touch and on seeds, which is a serious problem in peppers. There have been 4 dominant alleles of genes described, L1 through L4, and to date, L4 has been effective against all of the strains of the virus until recently, in the last few years, this resistance has been broken as well. So the search continues for more durable resistance. Against the tomato spotted wilt virus, there's a single dominant gene from Capsicum chinense, which also has been broken in many locations in the world by resistance breaking strains. However, it's still utilized quite a bit in the industry, and it's certainly better than having no resistance at all. Unfortunately, no R genes have been characterized against the begamoviruses, and we sorely need them. There have been reports in the literature of resistant germplasm, but nobody's characterized if it's actually genetic due to an R gene or if it's something to do with the vector. It's not clear, but certainly more research needs to be done as these viruses spread and as the vectors become more common. Fungal diseases also are a serious plague on peppers. In some regions, they're the most important problem, particularly if you have soil infested with Phytophthora capsicum, which is very common in New Mexico, parts of California, in Mexico proper, and now in parts of Florida and Georgia. When you have this, you don't get rid of it from your soil. It's a very persistent organism. It's able to form spores that last in the soil a long time, and then when they become activated with sufficient moisture, they will rapidly infect and cause decline of the crop. If there is enough rainfall, they will also infect the pods and the leaves. Powdery mildew is spread through airborne spores. Luvulula torica is the species that infects pepper. It's very common in greenhouses and also in cool, moist climates. In parts of California, it can be devastating to bell peppers. Nematodes are a serious problem in many parts of the world on many crops, and pepper are not an exception. This picture was taken in Mexico, and you can see the dramatic effect of a part of the field where they did not fumigate against nematodes, the stunted plants. Fortunately, there is a nematode resistance gene. It's a single dominant gene, the N gene, first described from Santaca cultivar, but it's also in many other lines. It's been bred into Carolina Wonder and True Heart Pimento and other hot peppers, such as Charleston Hot and Nematodor from New Mexico State. There's also a single dominant gene in Capsicum chinense, bred into cultivars such as Tiger Paw. The inheritance also appears to be a single gene, but it hasn't been characterized, or allelism tests have not been done to determine whether or not it's the same as the N gene, which is in Capsicum annuum. As I've already started to mention, resistance genes have been characterized for many of the diseases in pepper, but not all. In powdery mildew, there are several reports of multiple dominant genes. Most of them have not been named. This is mostly a problem in Capsicum annuum and continues to be a big problem in greenhouse culture. Many of the wild species, Futescens, chinense, and peccatum, don't get powdery mildew, or very rarely do. They're naturally highly resistant. Phytophthora is a problem on any species of pepper, and it can be a problem in any region. Fortunately, multiple dominant genes have been described in these particular germplasm accessions. However, there has been a great deal of linkage drag experience in trying to integrate these genes into useful types. There are now useful Capsicum annuum cultivars with resistance, but it's still not the level of resistance that exists in the wild types. In our own lab, we've examined and characterized resistance that's recessive from another source. It is, unfortunately, 2 recessive genes make it a lot more difficult to breed with. However, we have not yet encountered any linkage drag when introducing these genes into chili or Anaheim type peppers. Now, peppers are notorious for their spiciness. Very few other crops, an exception would be black pepper and horseradish, can provide this type of piquancy in the cuisine, and that's why they've become the most popular spice in the world. However, capsaicin is not something to be trifled with and can be very irritating to some people. It is not water soluble, so you can't get rid of the sensation by drinking water. The best way to get rid of it is to drink a dairy product or eat ice cream because it's fat soluble. It will penetrate the skin, and it's actually used in analgesics and pain therapy medications. It's also now being used in cancer research because it has the capacity, apparently, to inhibit some tumor cells. It does, in particular for some people, lead to the release of morphine-like endorphins, and so it's said that people who become accustomed to eating hot peppers can't stop eating them. This might be due to the mild euphoria that results from that. It has also become common in some cultures to use peppers as a folk remedy for certain ailments. They're also considered to be a crop or a food that brings a hot sensation, like a ginseng or other herbals. All of these things should be considered, and also if you have issues with stomach, such as acid reflux, it should be considered before consuming peppers because they can induce that problem in certain individuals. Nonetheless, I think they will continue to be the most important crop spice in the world, and we really have the Native Americans to thank for that, because long before the New World was discovered by Columbus, the Native Americans had been cultivating and breeding and selecting the different species of peppers probably for about 7,000 years. That concludes what I have to say, and I hope you've enjoyed learning about hot peppers.